In every city, there are stories that never made the papers. Not because they weren't important, but because they were inconvenient. They live in forgotten files, in half-finished investigations, in questions no one wanted answered. This isn't where justice always wins. This is where the echoes remain. This is Reverberating Noir. Some cities carry their history in monuments. Austin carries hers in silence, in the spaces between gas lamps, in the small cabins set back from the main houses, in the names that almost didn't get written down at all. Welcome to Reverberating Noir. I'm Adam Jones.
And I'm Nina Jovovich. Tonight we're going back, way back, to a case that most people have never heard of, and once they do, they can't quite shake it. Because this isn't just history, it's a template.
1884, Austin, Texas. A city in the middle of becoming something. The university had just opened its doors. The new state capital was rising from the hill country limestone, 23,000 people trying to believe in a future. And then, on the night of December the 30th, the screaming started.
And once it started, it didn't stop for a year.
8 people dead, a city paralyzed, and a killer who vanished so completely that we're still more than 135 years later not entirely sure who he was. This is the story of the Servant Girl Annihilator, America's first documented serial killer, and the case that still doesn't have a clean ending.
What makes this case so unsettling even now isn't just the violence, it's the architecture of it, the deliberateness. Someone moved through Austin in the dark with a kind of patience that is genuinely difficult to think about.
Let's start with what the city looked like, because place matters in a case like this. No electric streetlights, a police force that was small, underfunded, and as we'll come to understand, selective about who it protected. Gas lamps throwing long shadows across dirt roads, and scattered throughout the city, small detached cabins behind the main houses where the servants lived. Separate, isolated, vulnerable.
That physical separation wasn't accidental, Adam. It was the architecture of a social order. Post-Reconstruction Texas. Black citizens, many of them only recently freed, working in white households, sleeping in structures that were essentially designed to keep them out of sight. And as it turned out, out of mind.
Mollie Smith was 25 years old. She worked for the Hall family. On the night of December the 30th, 1884, she was asleep in the servant cabin behind the main house when something woke her partner, Walter Spencer. He made it to the main house. Barely. Bleeding from his head, Mollie didn't make it anywhere.
Her body was found at dawn. In the backyard, near the outhouse, she'd been dragged from her bed. An axe had been left at the scene. Not taken. Left.
That detail has stayed with me every time I read this case. He left the axe.
Which tells you something. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't running. He walked away.
The city noted it. The papers covered it briefly. And then, mostly, Austin moved on.
Which is the first failure. And it won't be the last.
Spring came, and with it, May the 7th, 1885. Eliza Shelley, 30 years old, a cook, a mother of 3. Her children were in the room when it happened. One of her sons told police afterward that a man had come in his face covered with a white cloth demanding money. Before the violence began,
he covered his face. That's premeditation. That's someone who had thought about being seen, thought about being identified. This wasn't impulse. This was planning.
16 days later, May the 23rd, Irene Cross, 23 years old. She survived long enough to speak to police. She described her attacker as a barefoot black man, and then she died.
Barefoot. Hold on to that.
August the 30th, Mary Ramey, 11 years old. I want to be careful here, because she deserves care. What happened to her was an act of such calculated brutality that even now, even reading the archived documents, it's difficult to process. She was dragged from her bed. Her mother, Rebecca, was beaten severely, but survived. Mary did not.
The method used to kill her, an iron pin, driven into the ear, has a clinical quality to it that investigators at the time couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't frenzied. It was precise. That precision is one of the things that makes this case so hard to look at directly.
September the 28th. Gracie, Vance and Orange, Washington. Killed in their cabin. 2 other women sleeping on the floor. Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson survived with severe injuries. A blood-stained axe was found at the scene. It didn't belong to the property.
He brought it with him and left it again. There's something in that repetition the axe left behind that reads almost like a signature. Not quite conscious, maybe, but consistent.
6 attacks, 6 victims dead. A city that had been, let's be honest, only partially paying attention. And then Christmas Eve, 1885.
Everything changed.
2 white women, murdered within hours of each other. Susan Hancock. And Eula Phillips, 17 years old, killed while her husband James lay injured beside her. And suddenly, Austin woke up.
The Austin Daily Statesman ran editorials claiming the city's crime rate was, and this is a direct quote, second to no place in the civilized world. The police force tripled in size. A curfew was enacted. Saloons that had been open around the clock were forced to close by midnight. Citizens formed vigilante patrols. All of this in response to the deaths of 2 white women, after 6 others had already died.
That asymmetry is not a footnote. It's the story within the story.
Dr. Lauren Henley of the University of Texas at Austin puts it plainly. She says it's crucial to understand these murders within the racial context of post-Reconstruction Texas, that the differential attention paid to victims of color versus white victims tells us as much about the society as it does about the crimes themselves. She's right. And it's uncomfortable, because what it means is that the killer had for months been operating in a space the city had collectively decided not to fully see.
James Phillips, Eula's husband. He survived the attack that killed his wife. And for his trouble, he was arrested, tried, convicted. Until the evidence pointed elsewhere and the verdict was reversed, he lost his wife. He lost his freedom. He lost his reputation. While the actual killer was still out there.
That's what happens when a community is so desperate for resolution that it reaches for the nearest available answer, the nearest available man. And the real question goes unasked for just a little longer.
And then it stopped. After Christmas Eve, 1885, the attack ceased. The city held its breath. Weeks passed. Months. Nothing. The Servant Girl Annihilator, as the press had taken to calling him, had simply vanished.
Or had he?
That's the question that historian J.R. Galloway spent years trying to answer. And what he found buried in archives, in court records, in documents that had been sitting in a Travis County warehouse for over a century pointed toward one name. Nathan Elgin, 19 years old. A cook working in Austin.
Let me walk through the evidence carefully, because it's important to be precise here. This is a case that never went to trial. There was no conviction. What we have is circumstantial, but the circumstance is striking. At multiple crime scenes, the Ramey home, the Phillips home investigators found barefoot prints in the ground, with a distinctive feature. One of the prints appeared to show only 4 toes.
That detail was kept from the public, deliberately, known only to investigators. Classic technique, you hold something back so that when a suspect emerges, you have a way to verify.
In February of 1886, 2 months after the last murder, Nathan Elgin got into a violent altercation. He dragged a young woman from a saloon. When police intervened, he attacked them with a knife. Officer John Bracken shot him. Elgin died the following day, and during the autopsy, he was missing a toe on his right foot.
Sheriff Malcolm Hornsby, who had investigated the murders, later testified that he had made a cast of Elgin's foot, that it matched the prints found at the scenes.
And the murder stopped the moment Elgin died. Not before, not after, the moment he died.
Galloway's conclusion is careful but clear. In his assessment, Nathan Elgin most likely was the Servant Girl Annihilator, but likely isn't certainty. And, in a case, this old certainty may simply not be available to us anymore.
There are other theories. There's Marisa Millay Cook, who worked near several of the crime scenes and left Austin in January of 1886, right after the last killing. No physical evidence, no arrest. Just a departure that some found suspicious. And then there's the theory that gets the most attention, the most dramatic theory. The suggestion that the Servant Girl Annihilator and Jack the Ripper were the same person.
The Ripper murders happened in London in 1888. 3 years after Austin, the theory being that whoever committed these crimes in Texas eventually moved to England and continued there.
It's a compelling story, and it doesn't hold up. The methodologies are different. The Ripper's attacks had a surgical quality, precise abdominal mutilations. The Austin murders were rage-driven, blunt force, dragging. The kind of violence that speaks to something personal, something explosive, not clinical. Historian Paul Bryan notes that the 3-year gap alone makes it highly improbable. It doesn't match the patterns we see in serial offenders. The Ripper theory is a good story, but good stories and true stories are not always the same thing.
And in cases like this, the distance between those two things is where the real danger lives. Because when we reach for the dramatic answer, we sometimes walk right past the true one.
What I keep coming back to, what I think is the most important thing to understand about this case, is the timeline of the city's response. 6 people died before Austin fully mobilized. 6! And those 6 people shared something in common. They were Black. They lived in the detached cabins. They existed in the part of the city that the city had decided structurally, socially, architecturally to keep at a distance. And that distance made them easier to ignore, even in death.
In 2014, previously unseen documents were discovered in a Travis County warehouse. Original autopsies. Witness statements. Investigative notes that had been sitting in boxes unread for over a century. They were digitized, studied. They offered glimpses, but no final answers.
Which is in its own way a kind of answer. That even when we go looking, even when we finally decide to look, some things have already been lost. Lost in the years of not looking. Lost in the years of deciding that some questions weren't urgent enough to ask.
The Servant Girl Annihilator is officially the oldest cold case in Austin's history. Officially unsolved. And what that means beyond the legal designation is that 8 people were killed and no one was ever held accountable in any formal, public, documented way. Mollie Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Orange Washington, Susan Hancock, Eula Phillips, 8 names, 8 lives, and a city that, for too long, only fully grieved some of them.
That asymmetry of grief that's not unique to 1885, that's a pattern. And patterns are what I think about when I think about why cases like this still matter. Not as history, as mirrors.
There's a question I can't let go of. If Nathan Elgin wasn't the killer, if the footprint, the missing toe, the timing, all of it is coincidence, then where did the Annihilator go? What does it mean that the killing stopped so completely? Did he die some other way, unrecorded? Did he leave Texas entirely? Did he simply stop and live out the rest of his life somewhere? Unremarkable, unnoticed? That last possibility is the one that stays with me longest. Because it means he could have been anyone. A neighbour. A familiar face at the market. Someone whose name appears in some other archive, in some other context, completely ordinary. That's the nature of this kind of darkness. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just disappears.
If you found something in tonight's episode, if it made you think or unsettled you in a way you want to sit with, please subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Leave a comment. Share it with someone who asks good questions. We stay in the dark so you don't have to stay there alone.
Austin kept growing. The Capitol was finished. The university expanded. The gas lamps eventually gave way to electric light. And the small detached cabins, the ones set back from the main houses, the ones that existed at the edge of the city's attention, most of them are gone now. Replaced. Built over. But the questions remain, not because we lack the will to answer them, but because some answers require us to look honestly at who we decided to protect and who we decided could wait. And that kind of honesty is always harder than solving a crime. This has been Reverberating Noir. I'm Adam Jones. Good night.
The murders stopped, but we never proved why. And in every unsolved case, in every city, in every era, that unanswered why is still out there somewhere, waiting for someone to finally decide it matters enough to ask.
The recording ends here, but the case doesn't. Somewhere, the evidence still exists. The questions still wait. If this story stayed with you, if it followed you into the silence, subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Not for us, for the stories that refuse to disappear.
Because as long as something doesn't make sense, the truth is still out there. And someone will find it.
Until next time, keep listening to the dark.